We're going to finish up the Great Depression. We were talking about how families were very stressed during this time period. Some families were broken apart. It was not uncommon for men to go off, leave their families to go look for work, and travel around the countries. It was one less mouth to feed at home, and they could maybe find work somewhere else. Some marriages split apart because of the Depression. Economic instability is really stressful on a marriage. Um, Families lived without. Some people even committed suicide because the depression rates, they don't just call this an economic depression for a reason. It really causes a lot of mental health issues as well. So you are going to make sure in your notes you write down that the stock market crashed October 1929. It was Black Tuesday. Banks closed when people rushed to take their money out. Businesses could not pay workers and unemployment skyrocketed. Many families lost their homes. Okay. Take a look at this photograph. Americans had suffered through economic depressions before. The economy goes through cycles of highs and lows, booms and busts. Okay, the government had always left the economy alone to recover naturally. President Hoover tried to do the same. Okay. However, previous depressions had not lasted very long, and they were not nearly as severe as the Great Depression, capital G, capital D, specifically talking about this specific economic depression. Okay, by 1930, it was clear that the economy was not going to adjust itself anytime soon. So we see a little Band-Aid next to Herbert Hoover. That'll become more evident why we have a little Band-Aid there when we do our next set of notes when Hoover loses the election. Okay, he's hoping that this thing fixes itself before the 1932 election. Alas, it does not. Meanwhile, as homelessness increased, families began forming little towns of shacks, like you see in the background of the picture below. These villages of homeless people were nicknamed Hoovervilles. Many Americans felt that President Hoover needed to intervene and help struggling Americans, and they felt that he was just cold and indifferent, when that's not really true. You kind of got to give Hoover credit. He was only doing what any other president before him had done. During economic depressions. He just didn't understand that this was so much deeper and so much longer lasting than it was than it had ever been. And he couldn't see into the future. He didn't. Some people felt that if the government messes with the economy, then it's not a natural economic recovery. So you just got to let it be. Some people felt, and some people still feel that way actually. President Hoover, president when Great Depression began, he was slow to respond, and he was ultimately not reelected. A little bit of a spoiler alert there. Okay, as cities were experiencing failing businesses, Americans in the Central Plains region of the U.S. were facing an agricultural disaster. During the 1930s, a combination of poor farming practices and years of drought created howling dust storms. Okay, so that's the moderate damage area of the Dust Bowl, and that it almost looks like an egg on the United States, doesn't it? So make sure that you color in your map. I don't mind if it's not orange and yellow, just make sure that you have two different colors so that you make sure you fill in the key, the severe damage areas, and then the moderate damage. Okay, so poor farming practices and years of little rainfall, major drought, okay, had created black blizzards of dust and sand that destroyed over 100 million acres in the Great Plains, or the Central Plains region of the U.S. Okay, you can see some photographs of the damage done by some of these dust storms. Ranchers had allowed cattle to overgraze, so they're eating a lot of the grass. That means there's no roots of the grass holding that topsoil in place. Trees had been cut down for lumber. We talked about the lumber industry here in Minnesota and how that had created some issues environmentally here in Minnesota. But when you're cutting down the trees, then the roots are not there holding the soil in place. Okay, farmers had worn out the soil by growing crops and not rotating crops. Okay, without adequate rainfall, to top all those other three things off, we had major drought and there was not adequate rainfall. The topsoil dried up and it was picked up very easily, and it was formed into black blizzards of drifting dust that covered farms, machines, and even homes. It also created illness, physical illness in people as they're breathing in this dust. They would cough it up and it would get stuck in their lungs. Pretty awful stuff. By 1938, nearly 100 million acres in the Central Plains region had lost 5 or more inches of topsoil during the Dust Bowl. 3.5 million people left the Great Plains when the Dust Bowl destroyed their farms. Okay, they packed their belongings up. Some moved to neighboring states and others traveled to the West Coast. Many of them used a famous roadway called Route 66 from the panhandle of Texas across the southern states into California. Okay, some moved to neighboring states, others traveled to the West Coast. A large percentage of these migrants were from Oklahoma and neighboring states like Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas, where the Dust Bowl hit the hardest. The travelers were nicknamed Okies, and they were not typically welcomed with kindness. In fact, there were oftentimes signs, just like you would see in southern states for segregation, you would see some of those similar signs saying, you know, Okies not welcome here. The view society had before this era was that people were responsible for their own economic stability. If you made risky investments in the stock market and lost everything, well, that's your own, that's your own fortune that you lost. And that's your responsibility to take care of your own needs. And to deal with the consequences of your choices economically. And that's still important to understand, that we still need to be responsible for ourselves. The problem with this mentality in this time period was that when the banks lost all of other people's money, it wasn't just the choices of a few individuals that made things hard for those few individuals. Those choices from some people ended up impacting almost everybody, and that was difficult.
The damming of the Colorado River created Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir.
That's not supposed to have any sound. All right. So as the Depression dragged on, President Hoover gradually softened his policy. But basically the idea was that private organizations like churches and community centers and immediate family, they existed to help people who had hit hard times. They were the safety net. But, you know, places like churches and the Salvation Army and community centers, there were so many people who had hit hard times and were in need of relief that the demand was massive, and those organizations did not have the means to help take care of so many people. So as the Depression continued on and on, President Hoover gradually softened his policy. To try to create jobs, he organized the construction of the Boulder Dam, which we now call the Hoover Dam. The dam cost $700 million to build. Today, the Hoover Dam still provides electricity and flood control for 7 western states. So he's trying to, it's a government-funded endeavor, trying to create jobs. Ultimately, President Hoover knew the government would need to respond. In 1932, election year, of course, he's helping create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to issue government loans to failing banks and businesses. He hoped that this would trickle down, that the money going to the finance corporations and the banks would trickle down into these businesses and they could hire people, and that it would stimulate economic growth by allowing companies to provide more jobs. And that's fine and dandy, except there's people who are starving every day in line to try to get bread and soup and whatever they can to survive. Conservatives criticized Hoover for getting the government involved in private businesses and banks. They felt, the government has no business using taxpayer money to bail out private businesses and irresponsible banks. Still, liberals were angry that Hoover wasn't doing enough to help the poor and needy. So the conservative Republicans were unhappy with Hoover, and the liberal Democrats are unhappy with Hoover. Hoover's chances just do not look good. His efforts were too little too late, and Americans began looking for a new leader. All right, and so there's the end of our Great Depression notes. Tune in to find out what happens when FDR takes office.